Good day, everyone. Alan Schimmel, welcome to another DevOps.com webinar. Got a great, actually a little different kind of show today. It's another one of our continuing series of video chats. And today's video chat features two friends of mine from CA Veracode. We've got Maria Loughlin, who is, well, I'll introduce Maria and Chris in a second. What are we talking about today? We're talking about making DevOps a reality, bringing in security. And this, for those who know me, probably already know this, but if you don't know me, this is a topic that's kind of really near and dear to my heart, in that this is the whole reason I started DevOps.com, and it's the whole reason I got involved in DevOps, which was, I met Gene Kim 5 or 6 years ago, and he was writing a book that became the Phoenix Project. And in reading the book and recognizing, what DevOps was about, I just thought this was the greatest thing for security. Forget everything else. It was all about security, and I thought this was going to change the game in security. And it's taken 5 or 6 years, but you know what? Today we have DevOps, or DevSecOps as it's come to be known, as one of the hottest topics within the DevOps realm. So we thought we'd do a nice video chat today on topic of making DevOps a reality, bringing in security. Today's broadcast is sponsored by our friends at CA Technologies and Veracode specifically, which is part of the CA family. So thanks to them. Let me introduce you now, though, to our panel. So our hold on, there we go. Had a little momentary issue. Our panelists today. So the lady on the far right of my monitor, I don't know if she's right or left on your monitor. Yep,
Good
Maria
morning,
Loughlin.
Alan.
Good morning, Maria. How are you?
Morning. Very well. Nice to be here,
Okay.
Alan.
Nice to have you here. And then joining us, the man in the middle.
Hey, Alan.
Chris,
Morning,
welcome. Chris Eng, Vice President of Research at CA Veracode, and no stranger to many of my friends out in the security world. Chris has been in the trenches with us for longer. Don't be fooled by his boyish good looks. Chris has been around a long time. So Chris, welcome. Maria, welcome. Let's get right down to our topic today. If we could go back to our title slide. Fantastic. So as I mentioned, guys, DevSecOps has really caught fire, right? You're hearing about it all over the place. There's a buzz when you talk to folks, and everything from the RSA conference that we were probably all at a couple months ago. I went to a local ISSA meeting down here in South Florida early, about 2 weeks ago, and DevSecOps was the topic of choice there as well. So, what does it mean? Let's ask a couple of questions. First of all, to you, Chris. As I mentioned, you've been in security a long time, and you've been an early proponent, Chris, of building security into our software development lifecycle. Now, how has DevOps become a game changer here? How has DevOps changed the rules or changed the landscape in terms of, bringing security into the SDLC?
Well, I think we've had to figure out how to adapt. When you were kind of making the introduction, you said how, you think it's the greatest thing ever for security, and I think it presents that potential depending on how it's implemented, right? So if you think about the DevOps process, the idea that, people do it for different reasons, and Maria, I'm sure we'll get into that, but essentially you have, faster releases, you have more automation, you have continuous integration, and for security practitioners, we have to figure out how do we inject security activities into every different part of that process, right? Instead of just being traditionally at the end where security was 20 years ago, right? You build a product using waterfall, and then the week before you ship, you ask someone to penetration test it, and then you find a bunch of stuff, and then you decide you don't have time to fix any of that stuff, and you ship anyway. That's the old way of doing it. And then, 15 years ago, Agile Manifesto comes out. We start figuring out how to integrate security into Agile Scrum. And DevOps, honestly, to some degree, is like Agile Scrum on steroids. Things are just happening faster. There's way more automation, and for us, we just have to figure out, all right, how do we get into the testing phase as well as the QA phase, as well as the coding phase, and even the design phase, so that security is kind of always there, and we have to figure out how to squeeze in with those constraints that developers now have.
Sure. So, Maria, you represent the developer's point of view today, and Chris is kind of the security
Right.
point of view. What about from the developer's perspective? How has DevOps changed the DevOps has
Yeah.
changed many things, but specifically security.
Yeah. Yeah. A little bit of context. So I've been an engineering leader for about 20 years. And at Veracode, I manage some of the engineering teams that build our products. And we started to adopt DevOps about 2 years ago. And Chris and I are partners in this. We're peers in the organization. And we had to think together how we make sure that security becomes an integral part of our SDLC as it changes to DevOps. I think for me, DevOps makes life easier in two ways. One is that engineers are oriented to take operational responsibility for their code. And so really, I see my developers and my operations engineers thinking more broadly. Developers used to think about the code that they're writing and is this functionally correct? And now in our process, in our life cycle, in the way we're thinking within our Scrum teams, we're thinking end to end. And so taking ownership of security is part of that. And I think that the DevOps mindset is becoming part of how we think, which makes conversations about security as well as operational considerations more relevant and more easy to bring to the team and have them pull the information. I think
Absolutely.
Chris mentioned automation, and I think that's also something that DevOps prioritizes very highly. It's in our ethos. We have a CI/CD pipeline, of course. And as much as we can bring security into automation, which is a core part of DevOps, it makes it easier. It makes it easier for us not to have security be this special thing that gets tacked on beginning, middle, end, or whatever part of our process. It makes it just like any of the other aspects of our security or our software development lifecycle.
So let me pick on you a little bit, Maria, about something
Go
you
for
said.
it.
And no, and you actually championed the developer side to the T. But you said something about, we've got to own security and we've got to stop treating security as sort of something special or one
Yep.
off, or I've heard it said. Chris, you and I both know a lot of our friends in the security space. That's where we run into a problem with them. They don't want development to own security. As much as they moan and groan about no one caring about security but them, you've got to pry control of security out of their cold, dead, stiff hands. And I don't know what it takes to change that. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, for some, I think it's certainly a control thing. Security has always been a control, and it's a lot of people really take pride in the activities that they do to keep their company's products secure, their company's network secure, whatever it is. And so the idea, and I think we'll get into this as we talk about people and training. I think the idea behind the resistance there is that they want to just make sure that their product is in good hands, that their company is in good hands, right? And so they are cautious about wanting to hand over to let somebody else kind of sign off on the security of something if they don't feel comfortable that the skills are all there. At the same time, there has to be, right? We can't scale if we don't figure out how to do some element of sharing responsibility. And like Maria said, I think with DevOps being the way it is now, people are open to the idea of taking some responsibility for security. But we're still kind of, in DevOps, we're kind of like in an awkward teenager phase where like your developers still talk about DevOps. Like we talk about DevSecOps or SecDevOps or whatever you want to call it, but developers are still like, well, I'm on a DevOps team. I've never heard any developer say like, I'm on a DevSecOps team. So they are willing to think about those responsibilities and maybe take on some of that, but I don't believe it's been internalized quite the same way that taking on the operational responsibilities has been. And so we're in this weird place right now where people are certainly open to it, like they're absolutely open to it, but it's not top of mind in the same way that the ops side is. So, yeah, we're gonna have to give up some control, and it'll help us. I mean, in the long run, right? We'll have,
I agree
right?
100%. That was my whole thing. But I want to come back to this whole notion of DevOps, DevSecOps, SecOps, DevOps, whatever, and why. But Maria, I felt like you wanted to say something
I
first.
did. So to me, what makes my team successful, I'm measured on the software that I deliver. Of course, it must be secure, it must be high performing, it must be functional, but the pressure is on every development organization to deliver more functionality more quickly. And so to do that, what I need to do is have teams that are fully empowered, that have all of the resources that they need within the team to create and ship the software. And so in terms of the partnership and the shared accountability that Chris and I have to work together, this notion of giving up control, I think, morphs into having security become a blended part of the team. Now, it is a shared resource, just like user experience and some of the other shared resources. There's not one security expert that Chris can give to every single one of my Scrum teams. But the more that we have that voice integrated into the regular Scrum conversations, the more successful we're both going to be. And so there's certainly an element of giving up control, potentially from the security point of view, but I would reframe it as trying to make the Scrum have the holistic knowledge and experience and perspective that it needs to ship software.
Fair
Maybe try
enough.
to reframe it that way.
Yeah. So here's my take on this. And guys, granted, I started this journey 5 or 6 years ago, squarely on the security side of the house, but I've spent the last 5, 6 years talking to DevOps teams and to organizations undergoing DevOps transformations, and I think it's changed my perspective. Obviously, people ask me about why DevSecOps versus, I think, Chris, you said SecDevOps. We've heard SecOps. We've heard all these things, and my honest, God opinion here is that there is only one DevOps, right? What we call DevOps it's not that very narrow definition of dev working with ops. It's a wider definition, umbrella term of all different parts of the organization working in a way, that is emboldened or kind of defined by this DevOps name. But security is almost a special case, right? Security, more than, let's say, QA or some of the other, fortresses or, pieces of the puzzle, needed to feel pulled into this. And so, I've had security people, Chris, say it obviously has to be SecDevOps because, after all, isn't security the most important thing here? And and they do, they feel that way. So when we use and DevSecOps is caught on. We did a huge thing at RSA for the 4th year in a row on it. I'm helping to do a whole DevSecOps Days series around the world, similar to Security B-Sides, right? And DevOps Days. So it's definitely caught on. But I really feel there's nothing special in DevSecOps that isn't part of the larger DevOps mantra or best practices or emerging, whatever you want to call them. We need to pull security in. And if that's what makes them feel part of this, then fine, let's it call DevSecOps. I don't think you're ever going to get developers and ops people raising their hand and saying, I'm part of a DevSecOps team. But the security people might.
I mean, I actually don't care what it's called.
Either.
I personally think like secure DevOps sounds nicer than all these made up words, but honestly, I really don't care about the terminology. I agree with you. Security does have to be pulled in. Here's where things get tricky, is because if you're on a DevOps team, you can ignore the security, right? If you are starting up a new team or a new product and you need to get it out the door, you can do that without ever giving a second thought or even a first thought to security. You can't ignore the ops, right? You have to put the bits
Right.
somewhere. You have to read the log. You have to monitor, right? You can't ship without thinking about the ops, and you obviously can't ship without thinking about the dev. You have to do those things, otherwise you don't have a product. Security, you can ship your product without even thinking about it. And so that's why it's so easy to overlook. And that's why we have to, we have to make the case for, we have to carve out the time for it. We have to allocate cycles for it, just like we do for development work. Otherwise, the default is going to be that it's forgotten, that it's overlooked, that something
So
else
I
is
think
going to take priority.
I think I could second that, because experience I've had is that if the organization, and this is often a top-down part of the organization, doesn't value security, yeah, it can be ignored. It's to your peril. But what Chris's point around it needs to be prioritized explicitly is probably correct. The corollary to that, however, is that I think security itself, certainly application security, is changing. So the threat landscape is changing. We have hardened a lot of the perimeters and watching network traffic in a way that wasn't in place, let's say, 10 years ago. So the attacks are coming through the application layer. And so as much as we are changing our processes for DevOps, we're also responding to a world where application security is changing. It's becoming much, much more critical. So agree that the word DevSecOps doesn't matter as long as the teams are performing the right functions, but also want to make sure that we do take the time to highlight the sec part of the application process, because it could be forgotten, to Chris's point, but also it's becoming more and more and more critical as the attacks come through the application layer.
Yep. I forgot to mention, and I should. I was in such a rush because I was so eager to talk about this today. There is a question section of our GoToWebinar control panel, and for our people out in the audience, if you'd like to ask Chris, Maria, or myself a question, please take advantage of it. Type it in there; it'll be queued, and we'll try to get some of them. But dead on, guys, and I know we got to move along, but got a specific question from someone in the audience on exactly what we're talking about. And really this, for both of you, how do you bring the security during the dev phase? What do you I have my views on it, but Maria, why don't we go with you first
Sure.
on that?
Yeah, sure. So I definitely want the voice of security to be pervasive in the team, just like I want the voice of user experience and the voice of quality. And so for starters, we have to have a representative of the security point of view, and that may be somebody from Chris's team, or it may be somebody who elects to be a partner with a development or QA background. And I think, Chris, we can talk more about security champions and how we use that program later. But let's start with that in the team, there is that awareness of security and somebody who really takes ownership of bringing that into the conversation. So then we think about software development lifecycle, and how do we bring security into the right parts of the design phase, the development phase, code reviews, the automated test pipeline. Automation and transparency are critical in the world where we have to deliver software quickly. And so in as much as we can bring automated testing tools into the IDE, where it can scan code, or into the pipeline, where it can run an analysis of compiled code, the better. As an engineering leader, what really turned a corner for me managing multiple software teams was when our security bugs flew into our bug tracking system as the output of the software analysis, in the same way that any other bugs, quality bugs, performance bugs, came into the bug tracking system. So I will always say transparency and raising the visibility of security in the process is the way to go.
Chris, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I would just build on what Maria said, which is, we've tried to take every opportunity to find flaws as early as possible, right? If you can find them while the developer is actively working on them, they're probably going to fix them right that minute. If you find it, at the end of the sprint, okay, now they've got to go back to something they were working on, 8 days ago, get back into that context and that frame of mind and make the fix. If you find it after you ship, then now you've got a ticket, you've got an escape out to production. The bug may end up getting fixed by somebody who didn't even write the original code to begin with, so you lose the feedback loop there. But the earlier that we fix things, the earlier that we find things, the cheaper it is to fix. And so we talked about scanning in the IDE. If you tell somebody right away as they're typing the code that they've made a mistake and they fix it, that never even gets checked in. It's fixed before it ever hits a code base. If you have developers testing their own branches in a sandbox before they check into the master branch, you're going to fix a whole lot of issues. Now, you're not going to find everything, right, that you would find in a final build or an integration test, but you're going to find a lot of things, and hopefully over time you find fewer and fewer things that get to those later phases. So we talked before about injecting security into every aspect of it. That's part of it, right? That's kind of how you do the tooling side of it. The non-tooling part would be, all right, before I even conceptualize a new feature, does it have security implications? So somebody needs to be thinking about, all right, well, this is a new form, so there's probably going to be an opportunity for a user to input something, or I'm encrypting something. Okay, that probably needs a security review. Or probably needs to have a security conversation at least to understand how are we designing this, what's the threat model. And so understanding those places even before you touch the keyboard of where you need to be thinking about security is another place that you have to inject. But ultimately, you solve those problems up front. You don't end up with a crypto design issue 4 months later that you then have to go and retrofit everything. It's always cheaper to do it earlier on in the cycle.
Absolutely. So, guys, a point of view that I've come around, it's not my own, I've adopted it, hearing it from others, is that the point of DevSecOps is that security has to become synonymous with quality. Maria, you mentioned quality. The whole QA journey in DevOps, right? When I first started DevOps, QA people were freaking out that somehow it was going to be the end of their livelihood. Nothing further from the truth. QA hasn't gone away. We've automated a lot more testing. We've synonymous with DevOps is not only going faster, but having better quality. It's the same thing I think we need to do with security. Security is synonymous with DevOps, is not only going faster with better quality, but more secure. And security has to become part of that quality kind of thing.
And so when we have these conversations, we often come back to definition of done, which is how does a developer or a Scrum team know that they're done with this particular story that they're working on? And so historically, and this would be historical Agile's framing, the definition of done includes that the functionality works, and it may include that it has a certain performance at a load to meet customer expectations. The way forward with what you're proposing, which is to make security part of the conversation, is to make sure that our definitions of done have security listed in there, and in the cases where something that we're doing touches the boundary or the perimeter or encryption or there is sensitive data involved. And so I think that there definitely is process as people parts of this conversation as well as tooling. Chris mentioned making sure that these conversations are happening when we're designing something in a system that touches something where we should have a security review. And we have a lot of process around that. So we use Jira, as it happens, it's Veracode for our story management. And we have tags when there is a documentation change needed for a feature we're working on, when there is a user experience review needed. Similarly, when there's a security design consultation needed or a security review needed. And so we bring that into the process and into our definition of done proactively. And the team sort of understands that they should do that. And if it's a well-functioning team with awareness of the breadth of what they're responsible for, then that happens by process augmented by the technology and automation.
Excellent. So guys, we've spent almost a half hour here. And we've talked a little bit about process, or a lot about process. We've spoken about the technology, and we've skirted around, to me, what I think is probably one of the most important aspects of this, and that's the people question. So, what about the people side of things? How do you interact differently in a DevOps environment than, let's say, in a waterfall or traditional environment? How Because fundamentally, when we talk about people, we're also talking about culture and cultural change, which is never easy, or very rarely easy to do in an organization. There's almost an inertia built around its culture. So how do you do that? How do you effectuate that change? Maria, how about you?
We use the word empathy across the team, security team and development team, and perhaps it's an overused word, but it really matters that I trust that Chris and his team have Veracode's best interest, that he and his team takes the time to understand the pressures that development teams are working with. So the more we can take the time, it's really about making that personal commitment to understand the point of view of all parties. The more we will find good compromises, be flexible, have open dialogue, come to the right conclusion where there are trade-offs across going faster or maybe going with a different implementation that may be more secure. And so I think that empathy is potentially overused, but really at the core of how we make these different teams with different perspectives and sometimes competing timelines or goals work together. And that has to happen with Chris and me, and it has to happen with our team members. So it's absolutely an organizational influence, cultural change that we need to make happen.
Chris, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, culturally, since you kind of started that way, security has to be viewed as important from the top down. So, if you don't hear that from, you know, your, certainly your development managers, but, your SVPs, your CEOs, even, that security is important. I mean, that sets the tone, right? But then, yeah, you have to build those relationships. So whenever I do a talk on DevOps or security champions, one of the first things that I do is I poll the room and I ask who's here from dev, or who would most closely associate yourself, your daily work with dev or ops or security. And typically it's about, and this is more of a factor of the places I go, I think, but it's about 50-50 dev and sec these days, and usually there's a few ops stragglers that associate themselves that way. But then the next question I ask them is to raise their hands if they know their peer, who their peer is in the other side of the organization. So, for example, if you're the VP of research, do you know your VPs of engineering for the products that you are working to secure? And usually it's a handful of people. So the question is, if you're working together and you're supposed to have shared understanding, shared accountability, shared understanding of what you're doing, empathy for what each other is going through, how do you do that if you don't even know the person, right? So I asked them to go back and figure that out, because, okay, when it comes to a crisis, when something is blowing up, there's some sort of crazy thing, vulnerability that came out that you have to patch or something you need to react to. That's the person that you're ultimately going to have to work with to get that done. What sort of relationship do you have if you're only talking to a person when something's on fire, right? You should have an understanding of what's going on in the daily life, like, oh, this release is really challenging, or like, oh, we're having a lot of pressure on this feature or that feature or whatever. You should just have that baseline of communication. I meet with Maria every few weeks. I meet with another one of our VPs of engineering every few weeks. I talk to our chief architect regularly, and it's not just when something's going wrong, right? So we need to understand what each other is trying to do, what initiatives do we have, what are we trying to push, and then ask for each other's help in doing that. So the relationships there at the leadership level are definitely important. And when you get down to the individual team level, I'll tell you about another program that we have from the people side, which is we call it security champions. I've heard other companies call it different things, but the idea there, I alluded to it earlier, is that you have to build experts on the teams to sort of be like the conscience of security when the product security team can't be everywhere at once. We have way more developers than we have product security people, application security experts, and we're never going to be able to hire one per team, right? We can't do that. Most companies can't do that. There are a few that can, but most of us are never going to be able to do that. And the development team also isn't going to give up an engineer rec to hire in a security person. So what we have to do is we have to take existing engineers and ask them to raise their hands to become security champions, and that includes a couple things. We're going to ask them to take on a little bit more responsibility for security, give them a few tasks, and in return, we're going to give them some training to be able to accomplish that. Having a development and a security background is a pretty marketable thing these days, so it actually is a plus for them. We've had no trouble getting volunteers to do that. Some organizations like to volunteer people. We don't do that. We ask for volunteers and they raise their hands. We try to get 1 or 2 per team. We train them up on the basics, sort of like a security boot camp sort of thing, and then we set them loose. We ask them to do very specific tasks, such as grooming stories, such as doing very focused code reviews, and most importantly, understanding what they know and what they don't, right? There's always going to be things that they don't know, but there's going to be a lot that they're going to be able to handle within the team, so they'll be able to be self-sufficient and not have to escalate outside to my team every time they need something. That gives us more bandwidth, that allows them to ship faster. Everyone's kind of happy there, but they do have to understand their limits, right? They need to understand when to escalate outside of the team. But if they can handle, half of that day-to-day work, or even 80% of that day-to-day work eventually, that allows us to scale. That allows the product security team to scale. That allows them to move faster, and it creates more of a working relationship between security and development. So I mean, I think everybody wins. We've been doing that program for I'm going to say about 4 years now, and it's gone through a few different phases of evolution, but I just really don't see any other way.
No, and I will tell you, Chris, I mean, boiling down, right? Communication, transparency, key parts of this puzzle. And then the idea of a security champion, I mean, it's brilliant, right? And I've seen it in other organizations as well. And Maria, I mean, feel free to chime in, but one of the biggest things that helps overcome is the scarcity of security people, right?
Mm-hmm.
We generally don't have enough. I mean, Veracode's a special instance. You're a security company doing development. But most companies or most organizations go the other way. And that is, they're developing, or the developers, they're doing finance, they're doing healthcare, they develop applications because every company's a software company today, but every company doesn't have that heavy security. So they don't have enough security to go around. They can't put a security champion on every team, Chris, right? Or Maria. And so being able to develop or draft, right, security champions from the dev side, wow, that helps solve that problem.
So last year, Alan, Veracode did a survey of, it was about 400 developers and operations senior staff members, and asked what security knowledge they had gained in their college years. And 75% of those people interviewed that took the survey said they didn't get any formal security training in universities. So we know that finding a developer with deep security training is like looking for a needle in a haystack. There's just not that many of them out there. So totally agree with you that this is the way to go. We have to be able to grow from within and teach the skills. To complement what Chris said, it doesn't come for free. This requires dedicated time from Chris's team in terms of preparing the formal, semi-formal course materials, the capture the flag sessions, the mentoring and peer review. And it comes at a time expense from my team for those that raise their hands to be the security champions. It is the only way, but as a reality check, the organization has to buy into this. And that's what I think makes it either successful or not successful in any particular organization.
Sure. I want to move along, but we've got I think, a good question from the audience that I want to bring out to both of you. Maybe it's a business opportunity. I don't know. For a small business with about five devs in the U.S. and 5 devs in the U.K., how would you recommend a dev doing a security boot camp with limited bandwidth and limited funds? Good question. I mean, I hear it from larger organizations as well as small ones. I mean, sounds great, but how do we make that happen in real life?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have somebody internally to deliver that sort of security, basic security training, there's plenty of opportunities to go outside to conferences that offer training. I mean, many conferences these days you can go to a 1 or 2 day training at the beginning of it that will just give you the fundamentals. I mean, we're talking about conceptually, not here's how to use all the tools and how to break into something or whatever, but just like what are the fundamentals of security? Understanding those concepts like defense in depth, least privilege, whitelisting and blacklisting, the sort of things that are kind of foundational and not so much dependent on particular tools or workflows. Somebody should do that and bring it back to the team. Go to a conference that has an AppSec track. Go to Black Hat and go to the SDL track. Go to one of the OAuths conference. Anything really. There's so many choices, and right. And if you want some sort of free hands-on, just learning, just find some of the CTF, the capture the flag style events. And I don't mean go to DEF CON and participate in the CTF. I mean a lot of
local ISSAs do it, Chris.
Local events, but not even having to get up and go to an event. There are CTF style exercises online. Google has one called the cross-site scripting game. There's one called Over the Wire. There's so many, and they walk you through from the most basic security check. They're incremental in skill set, right? So you learn as you go, and that's one of the things that we use with our security champions here. In addition to the formal training, the classroom style training and the lab style training we give them, we sit down. We have like an open session every week where any of them, or really any developer, can just come and sit down and work on those CTF exercises. If they get stuck, there's somebody from my team to help them along, but essentially they learn stuff along the way. So, even if you're just a small company, there's plenty of different ways for an individual to learn some of these basic foundational things. But you are I think, going to rely a lot on, if you send one person out to an event, they need to think of it as sort of a train the trainer style thing, not just for them to consume, but for them to come back and how am I going to share this with my team? It's not easy. I mean, in a company that small, you've got a lot of other competing priorities too, I'm sure. But that's one way to do it.
Yep.
And I might add to that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Alan.
No.
I feel strongly about this too. It's unfair to ask a development team to write, let's say, secure code or to have a certain standard of definition of done without enabling them and giving them the skills that they need. So going to formal and on-the-job training is a good way to enable that. I think it's also worth complementing it with automation. So if you're bundling different components into your product, well, look at the software composition analysis and where vulnerabilities may be in the components that you're bundling in. Put some security static analysis or other dynamic analysis in your pipelines. This world of the security and the threat landscape and what's exploitable in our software changes frequently. So I would say, yes, do basic training so people are thinking about the right things, thinking about their data sensitivity, thinking about encryption, but also complement with tools in your pipeline that will help to identify where there are issues that can be found through automation.
We're going to get into tools next. Before we do, just
All
going to
right.
take my moderator's prerogative and just mention to the person who asked, I spoke earlier about something I'm involved in called DevSecOps Days. So this is being really spearheaded by John Willis, one of the co-authors of DevOps Handbook, and John's really become very involved in DevOps or DevSecOps Days and DevSecOps in general. John was also one of the people who started DevOps Days. And so in London, June 28th, a couple of days after Gene Kim's DevOps Enterprise Summit, we're actually doing a DevSecOps Days. And for those who want to learn about how, whether you come from the dev or ops side of the house or security, there's something there for you. Got some great speakers. There's a whole community kind of fermenting there. And if you can make it to London, great. If not, check out DevSecOpsDays.com. And there'll be other, we're doing one in Singapore at RSA, APJ, and there'll be some others going on. Also, DevOps Days themselves is a great way to kind of learn what's going on there. And again, they're relatively inexpensive. There's one in every city, and I'd highly recommend that. But let's move on, guys, because we could probably spend 3 hours doing this, but I don't think they'll let us. Let's talk a little bit about tools. Okay, so where do the tools fit in? What AppSec technologies are more important in the DevOps world? We hear things like dynamic scans and static scans and this and that. Yet we still have insecure software. We still read about breaches and bad incidents happening every day. Has the game changed with DevOps? If so, how? If not, why? Chris, literally let you go first this time.
Sure. The game has changed, and this goes back to something I said earlier, is the game has changed in the sense that we need to figure out how to incorporate automation and tools earlier on. And so that means taking whatever technologies are available and using them at the earliest point possible. So we talked about finding flaws in the IDE. We talked about finding flaws at build time or within a branch. And you can do a lot of that with static analysis. That's what we do with our teams. Dynamic doesn't really come into play as much until you actually have a deployed system that you can actually run something against, right? You have to have you have to be able to kind of exercise the activity of the application and see what happens. That's the whole nature of dynamic analysis. But one other thing that you can do pretty early on, and is often overlooked, is kind of look for the building blocks of the application, to kind of look for inherited risk. And the idea there being that we assemble code, we assemble applications from different components, right? Libraries, open source, commercial libraries. And when we do that, we inherit all the vulnerabilities that are part of that piece of software. And what happens more often than not is that a developer will download a library to use for some particular function as they're building a feature, and then that library will never get updated again, right? Years will go by, and they'll still be using version 1.5 of that library when the version 4.5 is currently out. And what's happening over that time is your software is getting more and more vulnerable because vulnerabilities are being discovered in all of those components that you're using. And so checking for, keeping track of what versions and what libraries you're using and comparing that against the known vulnerabilities that have been discovered in all those components is another way of kind of keeping track of your exposure, right? When we talk about breaches, the breaches are not always a result of code that you wrote yourself. The breaches are sometimes a result of that shared component. If you look at Heartbleed or any of the strut sort of issues, those are all due to inherited risk. And so that's an area where I think tooling can play a bigger part in a lot of organizations where it isn't currently.
Fair. Maria?
I'll comment on another way we could use technology to increase our security. And it is by making secure components available. So we use a lot of containers, Docker containers, AMIs, people package their software in different ways. Well, making sure that the containers that are used off the shelf by your development team are already secure and have the right versions of the underlying software and have some hardening applied is a best practice, which if you don't make hardened containers available, hardened AMIs is a common case in Veracode's world, developers will sort of start from scratch. And they may get it right or they may not get it right, but it really is an investment in the technology that I think, if done well, has a ripple effect in the organization. And similarly, if we want our developers to use a certain type of authentication or encryption, we don't want every Scrum team reinventing the wheel here. So again, putting a baseline of technology, making it available for use around the organization is a way to use technology to our advantage and sort of prevent rather than fix security issues in these particular components.
Yeah, that's a really good one, and in fact, on the shared libraries, the shared components thing, that's kind of exactly what we do here, Alan, for those common things, whether it's encoding or validation or crypto or logging or whatever have you. The product security team maintains that centralized repository of those common functions, and oftentimes, when we don't have a function for something, sometimes we'll write it for them. Other times we'll work with the developer for them to write it and then make it part of that library. And so now they're actually contributing to a security project, centralized security project, which makes them more likely to use that project in the future. And it's something that you build over time. The other thing I think I want to say about tools and technology, which we kind of got into earlier, but didn't say it explicitly, was that it's really important, I've found, for the security team to be using the same tools, to be building things on top of the tool chains and the workflows that the developers are already using. And so Maria mentioned that, like, when the bugs started coming into Jira, which we use for everything else, things became easier. And that's true, right? You can't try to have a separate system for your security bugs. You can't rely on a PDF or an Excel sheet for your security issues when all of your other bugs are coming in through through Jira or some other bug tracker. Similarly, we've looked at the tool chains that developers are using, and when we say, hey, we want you to scan statically every build you do, that means getting in with whatever they're using, right? Whether that's a Jenkins integration, whether that's building a GitLab CI/CD a pipeline for them and saying, like, here's a chunk of code that you can use, just drop this into your CI/CD and the scan will happen. Finding ways to make it like as low friction as possible for them to incorporate those activities has been really important. And that takes a little bit of effort, because you have all these different teams, and some of them are, the number of different tool chains and build systems that we have at a company, even our small size, is incredible. So as you get to a larger company, that becomes more of a challenge. But if you can put stuff where the developers live, in the tools that they're used to, you're going to have a better chance of success, I think.
Yep. So, guys, sometimes it feels, and for years in security, like in security, we play a whack-a-mole game, right? As soon as we bang one mole on the head, another one pops out of a different hole. And it's a never-ending, sometimes I just feel like we just don't win, right? Because there's always a new mole to whack. And, with DevOps, are we whacking the old moles and making new moles here? Or, because at the end of the day, please tell me we're making progress, right? Maria, what do you think?
I think that there's an element of you are never done. I think that in an organization, you have to have alignment and an open dialogue around how much effort, how are we going to prioritize our security investment? How much effort do we put into this? Most large organizations will have a security policy, which will say different classifications of data, how they should be handled, what our tolerance is. And I think that's essential because this could be a never-ending investment, and it's important that there's dialogue so that the investment that you're putting into security of any piece of software matches the risk that your organization is facing by not investing in security. Are we making progress? I think there's good news and bad news. On the bad news side, we are seeing developers continue, and this is speaking of Veracode, but also our extended customer base. We're seeing in the applications that we scan that a lot of the in the industry understood software vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting, SQL injection are still being written and injected into software. So we're not done here in this quest. We have to build secure software. There is still a lot of work for us to do. I think that DevOps, DevSecOps brings security more into the forefront and opens the minds of development and ops organizations and security organizations for how to do this. But share with you the perspective that there's a lot of work to do here.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be whack-a-mole to some extent. I mean, we can't expect, I think, anything to completely solve the problem, but I think that's okay as long as we're getting better. I mean, we're having to adapt to new languages and frameworks coming out all the time, new development methodologies. At the same time, like, I mean, QA hasn't gone away either, right? And we don't sit around saying like, oh God, QA isn't a solved problem, right? Like, it's there. It's part of what goes into building quality software, quality products. So is security, right? There's always going to be mistakes. We're always and what we need to do is find and fix them earlier, give people better training. We can chip away at the problem, but it's not going to come a point where we just don't have to do security anymore, just like there's not going to come a point where we just don't have to do QA anymore. It's part of building quality software. We are seeing trends that are promising though, and one thing we do on a yearly basis is we look at stats from all of our customers and how they are using Veracode technologies. And one that was really promising that we looked at last year was just sort of the frequency of scanning. And I think we had something like 1.5% of the applications under management in our system were being scanned daily. Right? That indicates that somebody is probably doing something DevOpsy. There's certainly some automation there. The number of scans being done by API users as opposed to human users. Human users meaning like you log into the website and you upload your artifacts as opposed to doing it through a Jenkins or a GitLab or something like that. API users scans are going way up. And so we're seeing this push to automation. That can only be a good thing because it tells us that our customers are getting security information earlier and they can act on it earlier. So there's some promising trends in there, and we'll be looking for more stuff like that when we do the report this year.
Absolutely. And then that is kind of heartening. Guys, we only have about 5 minutes left. I want to ask maybe one other question if we can. And that is, what's winning look like? How do we I think Maria might have mentioned it earlier, but honestly, can you give our audience what metrics should we measure or look at? If not metrics, what other benchmarks can we look at that give us an indication of, are we winning? Are we making progress? Because everything gets measured, right, at some point.
Right. I can jump in on the developer perspective on that. Thank you, Chris. And I have development metrics that I care about deeply. One of them is escapes. How many times are we writing bugs that then we have to fix later? Rather than tracking security and security issues separately from the rest, I want to have my security bugs tracked as escapes, which means in our lingo that they are released to production, that they're open to customers to exploit, functional issues, security issues, any kind of issue, or at what stage in the development pipeline are our issues being found. And so we track very carefully trying to shift left, trying to A, prevent the issues, but B, fix them as early as possible in the life cycle. And so rather than looking for zero security issues, what I'm trying to track is where do they show up in the life cycle, and looking for a reduction in all kinds of issues, including security issues that show up in production that we would call as production escapes, and watching to see that trend shift left. That's one that is critical to me and that fits the philosophy of let's have security be like the other things that we're trying to manage in our development process.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, we measure around policy compliance. We talked a little bit earlier about is your app within policy or not? Not meaning is it free of security issues, but if it does have issues, are you fixing those within prescribed amounts of time defined by the organization, right? If it's a medium level issue, you may get 60 days to fix it, or 30 days, whatever you define. But you can look at what percentage of the time are various applications or products in or out of policy. That gives you a very high level view into which teams are allotting the time to deal with that. The other thing we do from a product security perspective is we try to look at things from a maturity model perspective. So get away from like counting bugs. Certainly never like count bugs from one team to the other and try to compare them against one another, because they have different code bases and complexity and so on. It doesn't really mean much. Look at the activities that they actually do on the team. So like, for example, we talked about security champions. What percentage of code reviews are being handled on the team versus being escalated to product security? What percentage of the team has taken various e-learning courses or instructor-led training on security? How frequently is testing being done on the code base, and is it being done manually or through automated tooling and integrations? Like look at those kind of milestones across the teams and see how mature they're getting in those different areas. I don't think there's a good off-the-shelf maturity model for this sort of thing. We created our own, because if you look at like a BSIM or an OpenSAM, you have like 150 different things that you're measuring against, and it's just it's unwieldy, and it doesn't let you focus. So we took 5 areas, and we work with the teams, and kind of each quarter we're like, okay, our focus this quarter is going to be moving teams to the right in terms of maturity on, let's say, training, or let's say third-party transparency into the vulnerabilities that you're inheriting, or whatever it is. And we look at it that way. So in addition to policy compliance, we're just like, how are these teams coming along? How are they taking on some of this work themselves? And how are we kind of spreading security knowledge and responsibility throughout the teams?
Excellent. Well, Chris and Maria, we're just about at the top of the hour here, so we had a few other questions. Maybe we could do this another time. We'll continue the discussion. It was a great discussion. Maria Loughlin, Chris Eng, CA Veracode, thanks for being our guest today on this DevOps.com webinar chat discussion. I don't know what we call it, but it was great. Thank you both so much. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com Security Boulevard. You've just sat in. Many thanks to CA for sponsoring today's discussion. I think it was a great one. And we hope to see you soon on another webinar soon. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alan. Bye.
Bye-bye.